committed to helping and improving the wellness among our community of healthcare professionals. We focus on meaningful conversations with physicians and APCs while delivering vulnerable stories about overcoming challenges and providing helpful tips. Together, we can create lasting and meaningful change to help promote wellness for all. I'm Anna Nguyen, a licensed marriage family therapist and program manager for the Behavioral Health and Primary Care Integration Program for Providence. My heart and passion is rooted in my mission to increase mental health awareness, identify barriers and challenges, and create access of services for all. Joining me today is Dr. Aseem Desai, who is a Stanford-trained cardiac electrophysiologist, author, and speaker with a deep commitment of integrating heart health and mental well-being. He was inspired to follow this path by his father, who died of cardiac arrest at age 56. A native of Chicago, Illinois, Dr. Desai graduated from Northwestern University with a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy. He then attended Northwestern University's honors program in medical education before completing his training in internal medicine, cardiology, and electrophysiology at Stanford University Medical Center, where he also served as medical chief resident. With over 20 years of experience, he specializes in advanced catheter ablation techniques for treating heart rhythm disorders and has special interest in the brain-heart connection, focusing on stress response and resilience. Dr. Desai is the co-director of Mission Heritage Rhythm Specialists and former assistant professor of medicine at University of Chicago. An advocate for physician well-being, he has taught mindfulness to healthcare providers and contributes to Psychology Today through his Mindful Beats column. In addition to clinical and research pursuits, Dr. Desai enjoys family time, music, and yoga. He continues to educate and inspire through his books, including Restart Your Heart, his forthcoming memoir, The Masks We Wear, and through various media and speaking engagements. In today's episode, we'll delve into the critical roles of emotional agility, emotional intelligence, and resilient skill building among healthcare professionals. Our discussion is rooted in the understanding that mental health and emotional well-being are not just about enduring stress, but transforming our approach to challenges, allowing us to thrive despite the obstacles we face. So let's get started. Dr. Desai, I'm so excited to be here with you to have a discussion with you. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us.
Oh, thank you for having me, and I'm very excited to talk today.
Dr. Desai, can you share what initially drew you to the study of cardiology and how you began to explore the connection between the heart and the mind?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it was almost like reverse direction because when I was in residency training at Stanford, as a medicine resident, we rotated through the coronary care unit, and I just found it fascinating. I mean, that you were able to immediately make a difference in someone who came in with a heart attack by putting a stent in or resuscitate from a cardiac arrest. It was like very cognitive interest. And then as my career evolved and I decided to go into cardiology, I started reflecting on early experiences in my life. And my father actually had a heart attack when I was 3, and he was 37. And then when I was in the middle of medical school at Northwestern, I received a call in the middle of the night. He was traveling in India that he suffered a cardiac arrest, unfortunately. And so what's curious is that now what I do for a living as an electrophysiologist is implant defibrillators to prevent cardiac arrest. So things have kind of come full circle for me in that regard.
Wow. I would love to absolutely dive into that a little bit, but before we even go further, I would love to help everyone who's listening understand the difference between emotional agility and how it differs between resilience, because you must have implemented that at such a young age.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point because I lost both my parents at different times in my life, and I will say that the resilience that I had, the emotional agility that I had when I was 25 years old is obviously very, very different than it is now. And so I've actually been able to sort of compare sort of how I handle those events. And so we all talk about resilience. Resilience is basically the idea of bouncing back from some kind of stressor. And so you can have mental resilience, emotional resilience, physical resilience. A lot of it's actually borrowed from sports and the idea of athletes having a recovery period and then being able to bounce back from any kind of setbacks. So it's not about enduring the challenge per se. It's about you undergo or have some adverse event, you lose a family member, you get a really bad medical diagnosis, natural disaster. You can even have not just individuals, but companies that you can have resilient companies, resilient cities. In Louisiana, when a lot of the hurricanes and things happened, there were certain cities that actually came together and unified to sort of respond to those, and those are kind of considered resilient cities. So it's sort of that bouncing back. Emotional agility, if we take a step back and define the difference between emotional intelligence and emotional agility, emotional intelligence, or EQ, kind of the counterpart to IQ, is the idea that you are aware of your emotions and your emotional state, and you can control them in the appropriate circumstances. Agility, on the other hand, is actually more of a navigation. It's the awareness, but it's also being able to say, okay, I see you anger, or I see you hurt, or I see you sadness, and being able to utilize it in a productive manner. And I think that's the big difference, because someone can be emotionally intelligent, totally in control of their emotions, being aware of their emotions, but if they're just overly focused on positive versus negative emotions, and they're not agile or nimble in being able to navigate through what they're feeling and how it impacts not only themselves, but their family, their colleagues, etc., the emotional intelligence is not enough. That's why you need the agility piece. So they kind of talk about, emotional resilience in the sense of like being in the rain, being in the storm, and that emotional agility is like having the nimbleness to dance in the rain, if you will. So that's kind of how I like to think about those three. And, like I said, you can have external resilience from a physical standpoint. You can have internal resilience from a mental, emotional standpoint. And I think, unfortunately, and it's important, but a lot of focus has been on resilience in healthcare professionals. And so the issue there is more of, okay, I have a setback. Okay, I'm about ready to go through burnout, or I just came back from burnout, or whatever. How do I prevent burnout? That's important. But what we really want to do is figure out, how do we navigate life as healthcare professionals, as human beings? And emotions are things that you can't shut on and off, as you know. And you may have a very stressful day at work, and then you come home and you're still carrying that stress. You're still carrying those emotions. Maybe it was a heated conflict at work. In my case, maybe it was a really tough case in the EP lab, and you carry that into the home. And you start to realize that if you're not aware of, in control of, or at least be able to navigate your emotions, that's going to have an impact on other people. There's this phenomenon called emotional contagion, where people can come into a room and they have positive energy or negative energy, and it's amazing how quickly everyone's sort of demeanor can change. Like in meetings, for example, we see that. And so with regards to that navigation piece, there's a useful acronym that Tara Brach is a famous meditation teacher, and she came up with this acronym called RAIN, which is like basically, how do you approach a situation that is causing undue amounts of stress or major, like sort of big emotions. And R stands for essentially recognizing what's going on. And you want to be careful about saying I am an emotion versus I have an emotion. And we have a tendency to identify with the emotion, and we get kind of caught up in the same way as thoughts. We can get caught up in identity. So rather than I am sad, is, oh, I'm feeling some sadness today, and so she talks about R as recognize what's going on, whether it's a thought, whether it's a negative thought, a critical thought, or whether it's an emotion. And then A is having sort of an awareness, an acknowledgement, and an acceptance of that thought. So it's not saying it's okay for me to be angry. It's saying I'm angry. I'm not going to deny that I'm angry or I have anger, and I'm going to accept it. And then the next steps are, what do you do with it? And I is investigate. And I think healthcare professionals can appreciate this, because we're all sort of detectives. You have a patient that comes in with chest pain. Could it be an acute MI? Could it be pericarditis? Could it be acid reflux? We sort of come up with a list of different things. And when you experience a general feeling of being not at ease, that's probably the best way to say it. Something doesn't feel right. I don't feel good. I'm not sure what it is. That's where you go into that detective work. You say, okay, what's my differential diagnosis? Okay, I didn't have anything to eat today. Oh, I'm not hydrated. I didn't sleep well last night. those physical things can heavily induce our emotions. There's no mistake. I mean, you kind of think about those Snickers bar commercials where like the person is like a famous actor. I think of Gary Coleman from Different Strokes on one of those commercials. And, it's like this guy's going crazy. And as soon as you give him Snickers bar, it ends up becoming kind of a normal person again. And it's true, when you're hypoglycemic, you get irritable. And people don't recognize that. And so that investigation piece is really, really important, not just from the standpoint of naming and labeling the emotion, but also, what could be going on? What's different today? What variable change? And then N is nurture. N is saying, okay, I have anger. I'm going through something really, really tough. I am sort of putting together maybe what led up to it. How can I best nurture myself in this situation? And I think that's really where this notion of self-compassion comes into play, which we can explore. I'm very, very much a proponent of a combination of mindfulness and self-compassion. And I think in particular for healthcare professionals, it can be really important.
Dr. Desai, those are some great tips, and you touched on a couple of components that I think are really fascinating. And it's something that's so predominant in my field of therapy work as well. And talking about, one, resiliency. Of course, you talked about the idea of bouncing back. Bouncing back, as I am also a therapist and I've worked with many, many patients as well, bouncing back does not always mean it's a healthy means. So sometimes I've seen people avoid their emotions. They're not talking about it. They're using substances. So it could be going into addiction. They could be white knuckling it. And it means that they're moving forward, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's in a healthy way. Whereas it sounds like emotional agility is requiring a lot of insight, a lot of reflection, and a lot of self-kindness as well. I love that you talked about even the RAIN acronym, because there's this idea of externalizing what the problem is, externalizing a lot of the emotions, that I am not my emotions, I have emotions. So the difference between I feel stupid versus I am stupid is something that's really common, which is really important, because I think it plays into the conversation of why people don't talk about these things. Because if we have the thought of maybe I am stupid instead of I feel stupid, there's so much shame that comes about. And there's so many barriers and challenges that may be getting in the way with it. But Dr. Desai, I'm curious, through your career and your personal journey, was there a key moment for you that made you realize the importance of emotional agility in your practice?
I would have to say it's a plural word, moments. When do you want to start? I mean, it's been a lot of my life. I have a health condition that's resulted in need for medical leaves of absences over the years. And I think, initially I kind of went down the path of, probably not the most helpful techniques in dealing with it, just white knuckling it. And then I went through like full-fledged burnout and had all the signs and symptoms. And when I took that time off, I mean, it's sort of how life is, sort of happenstance. I ran into a childhood friend, Sheila Patel, and she actually is the chief medical officer for the Chopra Global, which is Deepak Chopra's organization. And they run like mindfulness retreats and meditation retreats. And this just actually happened not that long. It was about 5-10 years ago. And she's like, yeah, you should come to a meditation retreat. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'll check it out. And so I think that's really when I started noticing, oh my gosh. Well, first of all, I saw I wasn't alone. I realized a lot of people have very similar struggles, whether you're in a healthcare professional or not. We all have those basic emotions and basic stresses. But then I also found there's a better way to cope with and navigate this process. And I think the problem in healthcare, it's really, and the pandemic it's kind of an amazing experiment. The pandemic's like, what happens to human beings when you socially isolate them? Well, we're certainly seeing the aftermath now, whether it's polarization politically or geographically or economically, but it also highlighted the importance of mental health, and in particular, the first responders and, the sort of notion of healthcare heroes. I mean, while it's a nice idea, the reality is that we're just like anyone else. And what we do, yes, it may involve saving lives. It may involve some major impacts on people's health, but it takes a toll. And so for me, when I took time off, when I was burnt out, I had to kind of regroup. I had to reset. I had to say, all right, like, where am I going here? Like you said, Anna, there's movement. I can white knuckle it and move forward, but that's probably not the smartest way of doing it. And there's lots of studies that show, if you do not figure this stuff out, your health will suffer. And that's something even as like you take an example of sleep. Sleep's a great example. Sleep is something that traditionally, especially in cardiology, you're on call. I mean, a lot of fields, you're on call, you're woken up all night, and it's associated with increased risk of cancer, of heart disease, basically reduced longevity. And you sacrifice so much of yourself in service of your patients. And I think the challenge is, traditionally we always said, what's best for the patient? What's best for the patient? And we didn't really, you don't really, if you think it through, you can best take care of someone else if you take care of yourself. And it's sort of this selfish kind of concept that people have had for so long, but it gets back to, being on an airplane. We all hear that expression, in order to help even your child, put your own oxygen mask on first. And so it was hard for me to make that switch, but I was kind of faced with no other choice. I was basically going downhill, and I had to decide either I was going to continue sliding or I was going to try to figure something else out. Like that insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, right? And so that was a game changer for me. Like when if I were to recommend something at the end of this podcast to people, it would be learn how to meditate, mindfulness, learn self-compassion, and do yoga. Like those three things. I would say that those have been really big game changers. And the basic things like nutrition and sleep, like those two things in particular, can make a world of difference in your emotions. Like something that I just learned not that long ago is the microbiome in your gut. Some of the bad bacteria produce chemicals that influence your emotional state. So, eating poorly can actually result in a darkened mood. And so, I would say that, being in that burnout state was really like kind of a turning point for me. And again, as I mentioned, it wasn't like one leave of absence. Over the years, I've definitely had my challenges. And I think one thing I've really noticed too is I kept it all to myself. There was a sense of shame and embarrassment as a healthcare professional that you don't want to admit, share with your colleagues, certainly not your patients, right? And this notion of you have to appear like a superhero. And the reality is vulnerability is probably one of the greatest superpowers there is on earth nowadays. We're so isolated from each other in so many different ways. What connects us is when we share our stories like we're doing today with the idea of this podcast. And once we start to realize there's a shared humanity, I remember a very distinct conversation with a colleague of ours who we were very sad to see go, Sanjay Bojraj, one of our cardiologists. But he and I sat down one day, and I don't know, we were just talking about different things, and he was looked like he was having a tough time. And I said, "How are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, I'm doing okay." And I could tell something was off, and I go, "No, how are you really doing?" And just asking that second question opened up this conversation where he had an adverse event occur in a procedure, and I was able to kind of listen to it, and then I was able to actually connect with him on that. And I would have never done that before, never. But to me, I just noticed when I was in burnout, as I started building these sort of positive habits and looking at my emotions and looking at how I navigate things, good things start to come into your life. And whether or not it's like your law of attraction or whether it's actually more that you start to notice things because you're not having such a fight or flight, survival view, you start to notice the world is a beautiful place. It's a combination of pain and fragility as well as beauty and joy. And when you start to see things more evenly, then you start to have a more integrated life. And so that's how I met my wife, for example, was I went through burnout. The last thing I was going to think was I was going to meet my future wife when I was in burnout. But it was because I was a normal human being again, and I think that it just made a world of difference.
Wow, that's an incredible story. I want to go back to something that you said, Dr. Desai, the simple question, which may be a slippery slope of how are you doing? And there's a technique that's very simple that we use. The difference between how are you doing versus how are you doing really? Or how are you doing today makes all of the huge difference, because for someone who gets asked, how are you doing? We have a very generic answer. I'm
Hmm.
doing okay, it's fine. How are you doing really? It really implies that you see them. You see that something is going on, to say, hey, the ball's in your court. I'm here to listen. I want to know what's going on. And you talked a lot about being able to share this with your peers. An
Hmm.
analogy you made earlier is the plain masks that we've heard many,
Hmm.
many times, right?
Hmm.
That we have to be able to put that on ourselves before we help other people. However, I know for physicians and APCs, your entire career, your life's work is dedicated to helping others. For you, Dr. Desai, how do you find the balance of knowing when to take breaks, knowing when to check in with yourself and practice emotional agility?
Well, first of all, I don't get it right a lot of the time. I'm still learning. I think it's important to recognize that, especially when you're in the depths of things, like if someone's going through burnout, whatever, the last thing they need to hear in some ways is, advice on emotional agility and resilience. Like they're in that dark place, and sometimes you just need to sit right next to them and not even say a word. And so I think for me, what's really kind of made the difference is learning to see myself and how I relate to the world, and how the way I behave and my actions directly impact people and have consequences. And I lived a lot of my life, especially, when I went through periods of depression, you get very sort of internally focused, and you lose sight of the fact that, it can have an external result. And I would probably say within the last few years, and it was actually what had happened is we had a lot of sort of challenges, I would say, in some of our sections in the group. And at one point, we ended up having a retreat, and it was eye-opening because you heard stories from all the different physicians. Like, I had no idea people went through these things. And then you start to think of, oh, I have a challenging relationship with this colleague. Oh my gosh, I had no idea that was their story. And you end up developing an empathy and a respect and a shared humanity, and this whole idea of, be kind, everyone's fighting a hard battle. So I think really being able to, the interesting thing about all this is, we may think this is sort of like soft science, touchy feely stuff, and that's kind of traditionally how it's been looked at. Um, the science actually now shows, like, you have better cognition. You actually do things better. You're more productive if you take care of your emotional and mental health. I kind of think of the 5 rhythms of life. You have kind of the physical health, emotional balance, mental resilience, social connections, and spiritual. And spiritual doesn't have to be necessarily religion. It could just be, you're something bigger than you. But I think that sometimes, and oftentimes, unfortunately, it's certainly the case for me, you have to fall like really, really hard to have your eyes open. You have to fall hard to the ground to know when to look up. And it would be great to figure out like ways in which you could scale this so that you can identify in your organization or whatever, like who's struggling, who's not, and how do you kind of create a more unified approach to dealing with these stresses, because there's so much we don't know about each other. And like we have a special needs son at home, and so sometimes if I have to take time off from work, it's not because of whatever, it's because he's struggling. And I'm sure like we have similar stories amongst many other people too.
Absolutely. It really reminds me of this idea that burnout is something that's so prevalent. Everyone experiences burnout, of course. I've actually worked a lot with a research specialist on burnout, and the number one indication of what helps is connection
Hmm.
and vulnerability. Because what it shows is we can't control our everyday life. Sometimes we have things that will come our way, and we do the best we can with what we've got. But with burnout, if we can connect, if we can be vulnerable, and we can understand not only what we go through, but what someone else goes through as well, and we have that normalization of the
Hmm.
emotional experience, it helps so much. Dr. Desai, I know
I,
you've done a. Go ahead.
no, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I know you've done a lot of work with educating healthcare professionals. Do you have any other tips or tricks that could be helpful for our listeners to know?
Yeah, I would say start small. Micro steps are key with any behavior change. There's a lot of science that shows that. So say, for example, you want to start learning how to meditate or do a mindfulness practice, download the app. I like Calm. Calm's one of the best ones out there. Start 5 minutes a day or 5 minutes 3 times a week. It's just like, it's all the stuff we prescribe for our patients that we just don't do for ourselves. And so start small. I think is really key, this idea of micro steps. Accountability partners, like a colleague, a friend, a family member, say, you know what, I'm starting this journey. I'm starting this journey of trying to improve my emotional, mental health and life. Will you be on that journey with me? And I think that in addition to the mindfulness piece, because the mindfulness, it's all about the fact that we're not our thoughts, right? We're a witness to our thoughts. We're a witness. And so that way you're not getting taken on a ride, with whatever, oh my gosh, this procedure went, really long today. Oh, that must mean I'm a terrible doctor. Okay, I shouldn't do the procedure next week because I'm a terrible doctor. Oh, and whatever. Or I got this bad patient review amongst the 100 other positive reviews. Of course, we always look for the worst one.
We filter.
And it's a negativity bias we all have. That's the thing to remember, I think, is emotions, it's data. I think if you think of emotions as data, if you get scientific about it, these are our body's ways, our minds, our body's ways of sending us signals. I mean, they may be maladaptive, but they are trying to keep you alive. Whether it's anger or whether even if it's something that sort of shuts you down, where you get freeze, like depression even, it's a survival mechanism. And it's really about trying to shift your view and reframe your thinking and the neuroscience has shown us that, that different areas of the brain light up when you have different emotional and mental states. Everyone's familiar with the prefrontal cortex, your sort of rational thinking center, and your amygdala. And your amygdala, we use this term, my amygdala is getting hijacked. And I think that's the other piece in all this, is learning the vocabulary, emotional vocabulary that there's something I heard once about, like, human beings only really know like 3 words to describe how they're doing. I'm fine, I'm angry, or whatever. But there's so many nuances to being angry. Am I frustrated? Am I peeved? Whatever. And getting good at learning that, there's a great book, Permission to Feel, that was written. It's a great book that's worth checking out. Susan David is sort of like the person who's done the most research on emotional agility, and she has a book called Emotional Agility, so I would definitely recommend checking that out. But I would say the healthcare professionals, realize you're not alone, and even if it's not for you, there's got to be someone struggling around you, and the hardest thing to do is to reach out. The hardest thing to do is reach out. But if you could, just like you said, Anna, if you could just say that, no, how are you really doing? And actually, sometimes it's just listening. Sometimes it's just being present. There's a great verse from the Bible: be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. But I think, giving yourself grace, giving others grace, realizing, I believe that most people, even sort of the most challenging people to deal with, they're trying to do their best. They're doing their best with what they got. And this idea of, being compassionate to yourself and to others, and talking to yourself as you would a good friend. We have a tendency to like beat ourselves up, and we have this thought that, okay, if I just beat myself up really hard, I'll do better. I'll work harder. When in reality, like, say, for example, that example I gave you with my colleague, an example of being self-compassionate for himself, you talk to yourself, you say your own name, so that there's science that actually shows that you are less likely to get wrapped up in everything if you say your own name. So say, for example, I say, Aseem, that was a tough case, wasn't it? I mean, I know that you're really struggling right now, and just know that I'm here for it. And when you do this stuff, it sounds ridiculous when you start doing it in the beginning, and I think as a cardiologist, like, that's not a direction we often go. We put in catheters, open up the arteries, and ablate arrhythmias. But I am so much more effective as a physician, having taken on mindfulness and self-compassion. I used to be a stress case in the EP lab, and what would happen was my stress would impact other people. So, like, say, for example, a piece of equipment doesn't work in the EP lab. It is not helpful at all to be yelling at people. It's the tendency, you want to do it because you're frustrated, you're human. But as I started developing these mindfulness skills and metacognitive skills, I was able to sort of step outside of myself a little bit and say, even in the spur of a really, really, like I could have my catheter sitting on the aorta or right near the aorta. And even in that moment, I've had cases where really like literally ready to go from one side to the other side of the heart and something didn't work. And my knee was literally sitting on the heart muscle tissue. Take a breath. Know that you got this team around you, anesthesiologists in the room, you have all the staff, but if you bring in that energy, and this goes for anything, if you can show up as the best version of yourself, and I would say this too, make it a practice. Like you have to, just like anything else, you have to create a muscle memory, whether it's like weightlifting or whatever, you have to create a mental and emotional muscle memory. And so that involves two things. That involves a daily practice. Journaling is phenomenal. Like I would recommend to people journal for a few minutes before you go to bed. Like that brain dump can make a big difference. Journaling, even a couple of minutes of mindfulness in the morning sets the tone for your day. The worst thing is technology. I mean, it's got a lot of benefits, right? But our phones, I mean, there's so much data, right, that shows that it can really become a problem with regards to your mental emotional health. So I would say that the journaling, the mindfulness, like make it a practice. Yoga is great, but then also develop skills to deal with the heat of the moment. And that's where breath work really comes in. And something as simple as taking a deep breath has shown worlds of difference. And I think the key is the asymmetric breathing, making your exhale longer than your inhale, because that activates your parasympathetic nervous system, your vagus nerve, your rest or relax response. And so you take in a deep breath and you breathe out, you make that exhale longer. There's something the Navy SEALs use called box breathing, where you breathe in 4 seconds, you hold 4 seconds, you breathe out 4 seconds, you hold 4 seconds. These are techniques that you can do and no one needs to even know. There's a new book that recently came out by Aditi Nerurkar. She's a Harvard physician, and she specializes in stress. It's called The 5 Resets. So I would encourage the listeners, there's 3 books I would recommend checking out. One is The 5 Resets. The other is Practical Optimism by Sue Varma. She's a psychiatrist that led the mental health PTSD sort of program at 9/11. So she was brought in very early on in 9/11. And then my colleague, my friend, Jonathan Fisher, he's a cardiologist and mindfulness expert. He just came out with his book, Just One Heart. I would say that reading, and just having those accountability partners, I think those things really make a big difference.
These are fantastic tips and wonderful recommendations, Dr. Desai. I also always preface with everyone that when we're building habits, it feels very uncomfortable at first because it's out of our norm. So we have the tendency to want to break the habit. We have the tendency to just forget about it, let it go. But sticking to the habit is probably the hardest part in the first 60 days. After we get past it, we start to find that it's a little easier, and it's a little easier to do to start to build the habit in itself. Dr. Desai, if there is one key takeaway for a person to walk away from this podcast to remember, what is it that you want to really emphasize?
That you are not alone. Many of us undergo the exact same emotions, and that there are skills that you can learn, that you don't have to be built a certain way to be compassionate or have emotional agility or whatever. These are actual skills you can learn with free resources, and just let people know this is part of your toolbox as a healthcare professional. You have many other tools, is to develop these skills of resilience, bouncing back, but also emotional agility, being able to navigate your emotions and be more productive and help yourself and help others around you.
And thank you so much for sharing your story with us. We really hope that this will showcase how to be vulnerable, how to make connections, but how to share our stories, express our emotions, so that we can facilitate more conversations to be able to normalize the experience. Well, thank you for joining us today on Healing You, Healing Me. We look forward to continuing the important conversation on health and wellness for all with more experts from Mission Heritage in future episodes. For more information on Dr. Desai, please visit the links posted in the description, along with Dr. Desai's website, draseemdesai.com. And for more resources, please visit She Providers SharePoint. And please remember, the information provided during this program is for educational purposes only. You should always consult with your healthcare provider if you have any questions regarding a medical condition or treatment. Dr. Desai, do you have any last words you'd like to share?
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you, Anna, for everything that you do. I think it's wonderful to meet you, a wonderful resource and source of information expertise. I would encourage people to check out Marvin. Marvin is a program that is a sort of virtual program for seeking help with mental health professionals. I've used it. I would highly encourage people to do it. And then, the last piece is more of just kind of something to just mention is that if you or someone you know is suffering from a mental health crisis, to just make sure there's help available. Seek emergency help. There's the suicide crisis prevention line. And I just think that we all really, really have much more in common than we think.
Absolutely. And the suicide prevention line is 988. It could be a phone call, it could be a text. They are there 24/7. Even if we're having a hard time in the middle of the night, it's a wonderful resource that's available. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Desai, and thank you everyone for listening. And remember to take care of yourself because there's only one you.